Well, at the time that September 11th events occurred, I was working for the City of Fairfax Fire Department in Northern Virginia as the Assistant Fire Chief of Operations. I was in my office that morning and received a call from the shift captain that was on duty at our Fire Station 3, indicating to me that the events were unfolding at the World Trade Center in New York City. I turned the television on and began to watch those events, and then I think, as everyone knows, a short time later the Pentagon was impacted by an aircraft. Our headquarters office was only about 12 miles away from the Pentagon, and I actually felt the impact in my third floor office at our headquarters fire station. Didn't really understand what was taking place until the news footage cut in indicating that a plane had gone into the Pentagon. The thing that's a little different about the way the fire rescue services operate in Northern Virginia is 14 fire departments operate as a regional service provider. So there really are no boundary lines between jurisdictions. The closest units of the appropriate type are dispatched. And so for an event of this nature, obviously it was a greater alarm response that brought resources in from virtually every jurisdiction in Northern Virginia, and then, as you know, over into the Maryland jurisdictions as well. The city fire chief happened to be out of the area at the time, and so my first duties were to begin callback of off-duty personnel to upstaff the city fire department, because it was very clear that this was going to be a major and long-term incident that was going to require a lot of resources. So I spent about the first hour and a half after the Pentagon was struck gearing the City of Fairfax resources up so that we could contribute as well as keep our city services in place for our own community at the same time. I then left as greater alarms were sounded. I arrived at the Pentagon just before 10 o'clock in the morning, so the Pentagon incident had been unfolding for better than an hour before I arrived. When I arrived on scene, as I think everyone probably has the same impression as the responders did, just how horrific this event was that was unfolding. The Pentagon is constructed in a series of rings. The outermost ring is known as the E ring, E as in Edward, and that's where the aircraft struck the building and penetrated through 3 rings inside to the service corridor of the C ring of the building. A lot of people might not realize there's actually a roadway you can travel completely around the Pentagon between the B and C ring inside. And that's where the front end of the aircraft came to rest, actually in that service corridor after it came through the wall of the C ring. Heavy fire conditions on multiple floors made it very difficult for the firefighting forces to operate to conduct search and rescue. And that's primarily because the Pentagon, in terms of the way it's constructed, is a fortress. So our traditional means of operating, being able to go through windows over ladders, for example, were all being defeated by the heavy construction of that building and the bulletproof windows and those kinds of things. So it became very labor intensive. All the firefighting forces had to hand carry all their equipment through multiple rings of the Pentagon just to get to the area that they had to set up and go to work. Probably the most devastating incident in my career that I've experienced, not just the magnitude, but the extensive loss of life. And the fact that this was all taking place in the specter of the fact that our country was being attacked by, at that time, unknown forces in multiple locations. And that threat continued during the operation at the Pentagon. All firefighting forces were withdrawn several times when the FBI notified the incident commanders that reports of additional inbound aircraft were coming toward the Pentagon. And so everyone was pulled back to an area of safety away from the building. So we also ended up in an operation that began to start and stop several times until these threats were cleared. Probably the greatest point of comfort, if there really was such a thing that day, was when we saw the fighter aircraft circling overhead over the Pentagon, knowing that we had that protective cap in place, allowed us to go back to work and really concentrate on the work at hand. It became very quickly understandable that anyone that was on the aircraft had probably perished, as well as a number of the staff within the Pentagon that were at work already when this occurred. The operations continued. My particular role As the afternoon continued, I was assigned to be the division commander of what was known as the A&E division. So I was operating at a command post in the inner courtyard, responsible for the crews that were working inside in rings A through E. That still had pretty extensive search and rescue operations underway. And I remained at the Pentagon overnight. I was initially relieved about 9 o'clock the next morning. The overnight hours became pretty interesting because it got too dark to be able to actually work safely. There was an extensive fire burning in the built-up roof area that we had crews on the roof most of the afternoon trying to dig out and control the fire spread that was running in the metal deck roof that was covered by heavy slate materials. The direction came to my command area from the incident commander to set up heavy streams and just flow water through the overnight hours to try to control the fire spread until daybreak, when we could safely return crews back up on the roof to finish digging that fire out. That's where a connection to Frederick, Maryland came in, because when I received those orders, I really didn't have enough resources to carry that out, and I was looking for an additional ladder truck to get into the inner courtyard. Arlington County had one ladder truck operating inside. Kind of an interesting side note, this was a brand new aerial ladder truck that they had just taken delivery of, and they had to cut the tiller cage off of this brand new vehicle to get it to go through the service tunnel. The service tunnel actually travels underground under the Pentagon and comes back up in this service corridor I mentioned, and then fully through into the inner courtyard. It takes a ladder truck that was 10 feet high at its maximum to be able to get underneath of there, and so a call went out after I made the request to the surrounding jurisdictions looking for a very low profile ladder truck, and the answer came from the Woodsboro Volunteer Fire Company here in Frederick, Maryland. They responded, they showed up, came through the service tunnel without any problem, and I met with them initially, gave them their tactical position to set up, and that's where I first met Chief Mickey Fyock. The crew from Woodsboro and their truck set up, they performed flawlessly, they operated through the entire overnight hours to carry out their mission, and when sun came up the next morning, the fire had been successfully abated overnight so that the crews could get back in there at daylight and start working to dig that fire back out. That was pretty much the operational role on the first day. Again, because of the regional nature of the fire services in Northern Virginia, the way we operate, there was actually a rotating shift schedule set up of all the command officers of the fire departments in the Northern Virginia region, and we started alternating 12-hour shifts in the subsequent days. And I spent 2 other tours at the Pentagon during the initial 10-day window of fire department operations, serving as the planning officer for the incident command system on 2 different occasions as assigned there. So I guess in terms of what the Pentagon, interestingly enough, helped the fire departments prove is that all of the regional coordination and joint training that we had done in the years prior really paid off. But that event became so much more complicated because we were operating on a crime scene. We obviously had national and international implications. We were working with close coordination with the investigative team from the FBI. A lot of detail went into being able to conduct fire department operations, but at the same time preserve as much evidence as we could to support the investigation. The body recovery took quite a period of time, as you might imagine, with the collapse of the building and the aircraft debris, the fuel, all those kinds of things that had to be accounted for before the interior operation could be shored up enough so it would safely get in there and remove the body. So a lot of technical rescue work with the urban search and rescue teams, both from Fairfax, Virginia, as well as Montgomery County, Maryland. Those teams, a 3rd team came in from Virginia Beach. And again, a lot of strong coordination in how those duties were carried out to shore the building up so that all of the families could have the remains back of their loved ones. From what we experienced, what got overlaid on top of the actual fire department operation was the support that those emergency workers needed to sustain their operations for better than a week. It almost became its own little village. There were pop-up fast food restaurants, Burger King, McDonald's. There was a group that came in from the Southern Baptist Men's in the Carolinas that bring a complete mobile kitchen that can set up and literally feed hundreds of workers at the same time. There was a 7-Eleven store that was opened on site. Virtually anything that you needed as you worked in that campaign operation over the week, you simply had to ask, and chances are it was probably already on site and available to you. Major fire rescue incidents that I've been to in the past are normally events that are smaller in scope. While they can be emotional, they just had not had this extensive a loss of life. But to see this in one event that essentially combined a building fire, a crash of a commercial airliner, and the collapse of a very large structure all into one incident is almost unheard of, and yet it was unfolding before our eyes. I think the message is that we're a nation that can take a punch. Nothing after that put a dent in our resilience as a country, as Americans, as what we stand for when it comes to how our society acts and behaves together as the greater community of the United States of America.